Valsetz, Oregon. For years, a lumber town set deep in Oregon's coastal range. Like so many other logging towns of its time, it grew from humble roots to hold a special place in the hearts of all who lived there. For the children who lived there, life was idyllic, playing with friends and neighbors in the safety of the forest.
As a child, it was an amazing place to grow up. I mean, there was nothing to fear other than getting yourself into some place where you'd hurt yourself, fall out of a tree or something foolish. It was a great place to grow up.
For the adults, the old-growth forest provided bounteous wood for the town's mill, meaning steady, well-paid work. This was a tight community.
You grew up around these people, you've known them for years. And that just, very close-knit community. You have to depend on each other because there isn't anybody else out there that's going to help you.
But unlike its contemporaries, Valsetz was a company town, leaving it as vulnerable to the forces of economics as it was to the forces of the nature which surrounded it.
Well, the mill was the focus of the economic portion of the town. I mean, if the mill didn't exist, the town didn't exist. There was no other jobs, really. There was no other industry up there. So the mill was the bread and butter of the economy in our little town.
This is the story of that town, and of the people who were born, lived, and worked there. A town that was wiped from the face of the earth, not by fire, wind, or flood, but by the people who owned it. This is the story of Valsetz. For all of us, returning to our hometowns can be a bittersweet experience. The houses in which we lived, the streets in which we played, all hold many memories. But what if that town didn't exist anymore? What if it had been wiped off the map? Jeff Wheeler can never go home. But today, he's taking a trip to where his home once stood, in Valsetz.
It's been 5 or 6 years since I've been back up here, and the last time I was here, we had our Valsetz reunion in August every year. We have it in Fall City Park, and it was. I just got the whim to go then, and came up. Being about 5-6 years ago, it was even hard for me then to kind of remember where certain things were at. I actually know some of the people that live up here, the older folks that never ever came back and won't come back. And I'm sure it's probably because it's too hard for them.
As soon as the railroads opened the West to industry, lumber barons bought lands throughout the region and set up their own company towns in which they owned everything.
Company towns in America, of course, started in the East with textile mills and with shoe factories, and in some cases everything in that town was owned by the company. It cooked all the meals, and it provided all the beds, and it provided all the transportation. One of the best known company towns in America is Pullman, Illinois, which was constructed by George Pullman of the Pullman Palace Car, the railroad company. He built this town because he wanted a place where he thought it would be orderly and it would be very pleasant. There wouldn't be tenements. But I do think that most of the people who came to the West to build major towns probably had either been to Pullman, Illinois, or certainly knew about it.
Two such tycoons were Jonathan Cobbs and William Mitchell.
Cobbs and Mitchell was a firm that had been formed by two timbermen in Cadillac, Michigan. They, like so many people in Michigan and Minnesota and Wisconsin, came west to look for more land, better trees, and their company purchased the land early in the 20th century.
The land lay in the Siletz River Basin, deep in the midst of Oregon's coastal range. After their purchase, the company left the virgin timber intact. But in 1910, much of Oregon's timberlands burned uncontrollably in a series of devastating fires. By the fall of that year, the Siletz River Basin forest had been reduced to a charred and barren moonscape. Cobbs and Mitchell's hand was forced. In order to salvage their scorched timber, they needed to get men and machinery into the region and get the lumber out to the towns and cities in the nearby Willamette Valley.
One of the things that happened when lumbermen came west was that they found their best lumber in places that were not accessible by water. And that meant you had to get the logs out in some way other than a log drive. So that's where the railroad became important. At that time, we didn't have logging trucks. So especially when Cobbs and Mitchell built Valsetz, the first thing they had to do was build a railway in. And in those days, you also built the railway into your logging sites. So not only were they using the railroad to get the logs from the logging sites into the mill, they were using the railroad to get the finished lumber, the milled lumber, out of Valsetz.
As the lumber flowed out of the region, the trains also transported in the tools and materials necessary to build logging camps for the men who worked in the woods. These logging camps were little more than wooden huts with no home comforts. Life in the camps was almost as tough as the men who worked there.
Valsetz, like many communities, was primarily inhabited by men, but what was very typical in company towns was that they were young. And Valsetz is one of those communities where people tended to age while living there. They came, they stayed, and by the time the town closed, many of them were retirement age.
One young man who went to work in Valsetz was Ralph Thompson. Just back from the war, he came to find work.
Well, we lived in a bunkhouse. There was four men lived in each bunkhouse. There was 2 bunks in each end, and then a center where the heating stove and stuff was in the room in the middle. The cookhouse had all you could eat every meal. There was about 120 people that ate there at each meal.
The men worked hard, dangerous jobs in tough, unforgiving country.
Catch the crew truck, go out in the woods, and When I first went there, we were using the old crosscut saws. We didn't have power saws then. Well, it was all old growth, trees from 300 to 500 years old. Falling, one of them, you'd have to be up on a springboard to get up the same level as the guy on the upper side. And we chopped the undercut in with an axe. Well, we just cut them into log lengths, what they call the buckers with the bucking saw, cut them into log lengths, and then they yard them into the landing and haul them into the pond on the logging trucks. Then from there, they'd either load out the real good ones and send them into a plywood mill, and the other ones they sawed for lumber right there at Valsetz.
Well, the mill was the focus of the economic portion of the town. I mean, if the mill didn't exist, the town didn't exist. But that was where pretty much everybody worked, majority of the people. They either worked at the mill, they were either loggers that worked in the woods and brought the logs to the mill. You either worked at the store or the post office, or you worked at the school. There was no other jobs, really. There was no other industry up there. So the mill was the bread and butter of the economy in our little town.
The mill, completed in 1920, marked the start of a more permanent settlement. Valsetz, named after the Siletz River and Willamette Valley, was born.
I'm actually taking this road a lot slower than we did because it's your car, huh? We used to bust over this hill, get all these washboards and stuff like that, just tear your cars apart. I honestly think this road is better now than it was when we lived up here.
The road that Jeff and others traveled from Valsetz was built in 1926 to connect the town to nearby Falls City, and quickly gained notoriety. Valsetz was home to Ivy Van Epps for over 30 years. She remembers her first journey on the road well.
My first impressions of Valsetz was, I'll never come back here again. My mother-in-law took me up the first time, and the road had not been improved. So we met a truck coming around this corner, and all I could see was a canyon down here. And I started to open the door, and she asked me where I was going. I told her I was getting out.
Jim Travis made Valsetz his home in the 70s.
The amount of rainfall that Valsetz used to see, it was 16 miles of bad, muddy gravel road. And I had a truck driver who came up on a particularly muddy day and tell me that he had so much mud on his undercarriage that he was already overweight.
Jim arrived just after he was asked to be the mill superintendent in 1970.
That was on a Saturday, Sunday night. I drove up to Valsetz and stayed in a little place they used to call a log office and reported to work Monday morning.
John Hibbs' family moved to Valsetz with 6-month-old John in tow. Even then, the houses were not a far cry from the tents and shacks that made up the logging camps.
We lived on 33 Shanghai Street. The center of the house had been a bunkhouse at some point in time. And if you looked in the ends of the living room, that was the bunkhouse portion. If you looked in the ends of it, on each end there was an eye, a round eye on a big bolt about an inch in diameter, something like that. Our house had those eyes in the center of the living room because when they got ready to move them, they would put a cable in there to kind of hold the house together for the shaking it was going to take.
A company town housing, when constructed by the company, was typically pretty basic. Actually, the pictures of Valsetz show very interesting houses, but many of the houses were really nothing more than rectangular blocks. There were a lot of one-room structures in the very beginning that would have been typical in the World War I era. And then as houses became plumbed And the houses of Valsetz were plumbed pretty early. But as houses became plumbed, they would have added rooms.
Ivy was less than impressed with her new home.
When I seen the place I was going to move into, it had 2x6 planks on the floor. Now stop and think about it. 2x6 planks. Had a wood stove with coils, a hot water tank, a sink, and a shower over there. And the outhouse was out there. Pretty discouraging.
Whenever somebody moved, it was a chain reaction. I want your house, she wants my house, you know, and it used to be incredible. And to discourage that, we always said, you know, well, he rented it for $100, but if you're going to rent it, but it didn't slow him down.
Another feature of the early town was its plank sidewalks, built to keep people's feet out of the constant mud.
When I first went up there, we still had plank sidewalks. We had plank driveways.
I mean, I can remember when you drive over them, you know, they clunk, 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 clunk. It's kind of like a train running down the tracks, and when they hit the joint in the tracks, well, these are big, thick planks, and I'm going to say 4 to 6 inches thick. And of course, over time, with all the rain, and then the summertime, they kind of dry out. So when you drive across them, they'd always wiggle from one end to the other because they were a little warped, and the nails were kind of loose, and they always made a clunk, clunk sound, you know, kind of like clicking 2 blocks together as you drove over them. That's one of the things, you know, it's one of those things that comes to mind is the sound of that.
But despite the lack of home comforts, everyone agreed that Valsetz had a unique spirit.
Of course, you knew everybody, you know, you didn't just know them, you knew their cousins, and because when the cousins showed up, everybody was playing together, and you knew the name of their dog, and, you know, I mean, it was pretty tight-knit.
I think the close-knit, you know, the jump in and help each other out. You know, people left their doors unlocked and didn't have to worry about it.
I can remember one gentleman up there lost his wife. All of the boys in the wood, all the boys in the mills, anybody that worked up there gave a day's pay to him.
You grew up around these people, you've known them for years. And that just, you know, very close-knit community. You have to depend on each other because there isn't anybody else out there that's going to help you.
This is Cold Springs here. We always stop coming up over the mountainside. Everybody always stop here to get fresh water. This is Cold Springs, just fresh water. It comes off here. It's about halfway going to Valsetz from Fall City, and when the road got really dusty, people would pull off the side here. Always got water, and sometimes you have a couple cars, 2 or 3, 4 cars parked in here. It's kind of a little stopping point where people would visit. So.
For children, Valsetz was a magical place.
The young man woke up with the sun shining through his bedroom window. It was the 4th of July, or very near that. It was a very nice summer day. His dog was healthy. He had 25 cents in his pocket, brand new tires on his bike, and the circus was coming to town. And that's what I like to say about Valsetz. As a child, it was an amazing place to grow up. I mean, there was nothing to fear other than getting yourself into some place where you'd hurt yourself, you know, fall out of a tree or something foolish. For most of us kids, just being outside in the woods, running around, you know, I mean, picking berries, climbing trees, camping, whatever we could figure out to do in the out of doors, that's what we did most of the time.
Oh, well, of course we didn't have video games, so to say, right? Or nothing like that, like they do today. We played a lot of sports. Kids would meet at the school, play around at the school a lot, whether it be baseball, whatever was going on at the time, a lot of football. We had the basketball courts. Then you had your fishing, your hunting that you got to do. There's a lot of that you could do. So at nighttime, the town basically went to sleep, all but the kids. In other words, everybody went into the home by about 6 o'clock. The store generally closed around 5, 6, and all the parents and et cetera, it seemed like they always just were at home by that time. And then the kids would just walk the pavement to pavement, which was walk into town. You go past all the speed bumps that were in town and kind of go one end down to the store and turn around and walk all the way back to the end of town where the Valsetz sign is, which was the big old log. It said, "Welcome to Valsetz," and it was basically payment to payment.
Ken Jeske also grew up in Valsetz and made the most of his childhood there.
Hanging out with my friends, chasing, catching snakes, sneaking down to the creek in my brand new shoes and getting them wet, which was a constant point of me getting in trouble. We rode motorcycles, we hung out together, we went fishing, shooting, even driving cars before you could nowadays. But it was just hanging out. We didn't, I don't remember spending a lot of time in front of the TV, but I do remember a lot of times of riding dirt bikes and coming home, getting warm, changing into clean clothes, and go doing it again.
Well, we hung around different places up there. During the summer, you would find us at swimming holes, the hang-up hole, or maybe the boiler hole, and we had the Upper North Fork. Ranch was another one that some of us used to like to go out and especially if you had any horses, you go out there and you can ride your horses. There wasn't a whole lot of girls up there in our town. We have a handful of girls compared to the boys, and so sometimes we would actually pick a name in a phone book, call the house, and ask to speak to any girls in the house that are our age. And we would just go down the lines and just flip in numbers and point to a name, and we'd call there. And you'd be surprised how often we got to talk to girls our age up there. So,
Two of my children would tell you that Valsetz is their hometown. And they got to like it. I mean, it was a great place, absolutely great place to raise kids.
You didn't have to worry about anything. Whenever the kids left the house, if anything happened, within 2 minutes I knew what was going on. You didn't get away with anything. Oh, that's one thing. You living up there, you didn't get away with anything, honest. It may take a couple of days to get back, but it came back.
I can remember getting in trouble. We used to jump on the train to go down the fishing holes, down on the pond, down by Bait Log or Triangle Trees, down that way, down to the county bridge. So
I didn't know about that. Well, it didn't go very fast anyway. You could hop on and hop off any place between there and down at the junction. So it didn't go very fast.
One of Valsetz's children, Dorothy Ann Hobson, became known all across the country in the 1930s.
One of the most charming things I think about Valsetz, and one of the reasons that some people have heard of Valsetz, is that there was a little girl who said, "This town needs a newspaper." And so every month she sat down at her card table and wrote out her news and sent it in to the Portland headquarters of Cobbs and Mitchell. And someone there typed it up and mimeographed it and sent it out, because they sent it to people like Shirley Temple, who was exactly the same age as Dorothy Ann, and they sent it to Eleanor Roosevelt. Really, just great writing. And Dorothy Ann went away at age 13. Her parents sent her to Salem to board with a family and to attend middle school and then high school. And she never wrote again in her life.
For the most part, the weather in Valsetz could be summed up in one word.
Wet. It rained. Yeah, it rained good.
Valsetz traded places off and on with Quileute up in Puget Sound as the rainiest city in the contiguous 48 states.
I think it rains pretty much every month, half the month. If I believe right, the rainfall somewhere was over 140, 150 inches of rain a year, so you're talking 14 feet, I can remember times when it rained so much that the pond would flood up into the town, or even up to the paved portion of the town. So it rained quite a bit.
I remember the water coming through our yards, you know, when it would rain really hard. Like one Christmas we got 7 inches of rain in one day, and I remember the water just rushing through the yard, and you know, the kids, we'd go out and dam it up and cause it to go different directions, and that kind of thing would be our entertainment.
And then in the winter, the snow.
The year my son was born in 52, we had snow. I don't know how deep it was, but I went out to have my son. And I came back in March, and there was still snow almost up to the eaves of the front of my house. It didn't melt off until the end of April, 1st of May. My mother gave me daffodil bulbs, and I couldn't even get them in the ground.
Having said all that, the summers were wonderful.
The long, hot summers, the swimming holes, and the freedom of the forest was a dream for Valsetz's children. Meanwhile, the adults tried to escape the heat.
When it got real hot, we'd take and put a sprinkler on top of the house and let it run and open all the doors and windows. That's how we cooled off.
This, probably right down in this area is where the store was. The 2-lane bowling alley, the rec hall, post office, also your gas station. You know, we had a little gas pump. So it'd be right about where probably all that's clear-cutted area. This would be probably more likely, I'm thinking it's the parking lot and the roadway in front of the store.
Like most company towns of its time, Valsetz had a company store.
You know, the company store is probably the best known feature of company towns. In reality, the company store was often a really important part of the community in a positive way. And in the company town, stores typically sold on credit, which was not available always elsewhere. And as some people have written, you know, yes, the goods were expensive, but you had credit available, and often it was pretty high quality stuff.
Had boarded sidewalks in front of the store, and so people like, you know, you dropped coins and go underneath the sidewalk or the little deck. And I can remember being a little kid and crawling in there, and they were looking for pennies. So just where I can have penny candy. So. Oh, wooden floors. So you had 3 aisles on the storeway. You had 3 aisles. You know, your basic canned foods, things like that. You had a small refrigerator area for the beer. A lot of it was more of a cooler type of setting where you just reach in and got what you wanted. Then I can also remember where we kept all the ice cream bars and stuff. I can remember having to jump up to kind of lean over into getting it, you know.
I can remember the kids going down to the store, and of course we had one of those big bins where they had ice cream bars and stuff like that. One of them got stuck in it. He couldn't reach down, so when he reached over too far, he went in.
One of the architecturally interesting features in early Valsetz was the company store, which also had the post office and the postmistress's apartment. And it was a very typical style of the period. It was a fairly elaborate, half-timbered building with dormers. It had a Tudor look to it, but certainly nothing like the squat little supermarkets that we see. And it was actually fairly typical of other company towns of the era.
The store was part of a cluster of buildings around which the town's social life revolved.
One of the things that always comes up is the mountain burger at the restaurant. And they had this cheeseburger with bacon that was absolutely delicious. They made a great hamburger. We had a recreational center. Part of the recreational center was a theater. And so Fridays and Saturday nights you could go watch, maybe Hopalong Cassidy or Roy Rogers, or typically it was a Western, but there might have been an Alfred Hitchcock show or something. Wasn't a particularly big building, but it could hold probably most of the town at any given moment.
The town's bowling alley also provided people with a welcome excuse to socialize.
We had a 2-lane bowling alley, which kept people busy during the week. Like I believe league was like on Tuesday and Thursday nights, so a lot of people participated in bowling leagues. They had a women's league and a men's and women's league.
I helped put that bowling alley together. A guy from Brunswick come up there and I helped him nail everything together and put the alleys in and built cabinets and things in the bowling alley and then the restaurant, back room. So I had about a 3-month job there.
This all out here would be where the baseball field was. Out here, it was behind, between the stores and basically the homes. But you know, every now and then we'd have some teams that come up from the valley or whatever and play, and I'm sure they hated to drive up to make the play. But every now and then we also had softball tournaments, you know, like a weekend event. So yeah, it was kind of neat then. It was like a big gathering in the town that time. We used to call it Mountain Days.
Mountain Days was a yearly festival for the people of Valsetz.
Mountain Days, there was always baseball games going on.
It was a softball event, big tournament of softball. People would come from the valley, which we always called them all flatlanders because we're kind of the hill people, so we always called anybody that wasn't from Valsetz a flatlander. Mountain Days was kind of a little carnival for us, I would think, at the time. That's how I would probably describe it.
I remember they had a parade, and the parade had, you know, it was a short parade through town because town was very small, but and then I remember all of us kids, we had a pretty successful baseball team, and I remember us decorating our coach's truck. The various other people, I think the church had a float, probably the baseball team had a float, the Queen's Court, that kind of thing. And then I remember around the store, there were several booths that they built, and we were selling beer sausages to raise money for the baseball team. And then there were several other booths, you know, dart throw and ring toss and those kind of things that you would see at a normal carnival that we had back then.
So I think you got to get up a little bit higher and it'll be more of a flat type of thing. But the trees are obviously growing up, but this is the old football field up here.
While he's in Valsetz, Jeff decides to pay a visit to his former school grounds.
You can kind of cut through this way if you want to try that.
The school was a very important part of the social life of the community. And in some communities, the single teachers who came in married and stayed on, and that contributed to the communities because it was often those people who organized things like the Great Books groups or the bridge clubs and many of the children's activities. One of the reasons that company towns had schools was that you were able to attract the more stable family men, because women weren't going to come unless there was a place for their kids. And so by bringing in families, you eliminated a lot of the turnover. There's an old saying, we have 3 crews. One is coming, one is going, one is working. And that was often typical with the single men. But with married men, they came and they got established. And the school was a very important part of the social life of the community.
In the late 1970s, a new school was built in Valsetz. The future for the education of the town's children looked bright.
I was in the old school until 6th grade, and then the new school started. It was about 6th grade when it went over. So about 1980 is when it was probably completed. It wasn't very old. 4 or 5 years old when they shut down the school in town. So.
Like many other company towns, Valsetz was initially a dry town.
It is. It's an old Blitz bottle.
Where'd you say we were going?
Right up here is the football field.
So that's what the...
That's the old Blitz bottles right here. Blitz beer is what I learned to drink. It was warm. We had to hide it in the hay bale.
Well, when I first went up there, there was no beer or wine sold at the store. And I don't remember how long after I had been there, the region manager consented to finally put beer and wine in the store. An interesting story about that. He liked Blitz, which was an Oregon brand that lots of people didn't really care for, but that's the only kind of beer we carried in the store.
One reason that Valsetz and many other communities did not have liquor sold in it was for safety. I mean, it simply was not safe in what was then one of the most dangerous occupations to have liquor readily available.
There were 2 taverns in Fall City, and if you stopped in at that tavern, they would ask you if you were on your way to Valsetz, and if you were, they'd bring out 5, 6, 7 cases of beer with people's names on them, and you'd take the case of beer up and leave it on the front porch of the store, and people would come by and know they had a delivery and pick it up, take it home, and then they would settle with the tavern when they went next time through town.
I mean, there was a lot of drinking went on in Valsetz at all periods of time. I mean, imagine loggers that didn't drink. Imagine mill workers that didn't drink. Well, that's not going to happen. I can tell you stories about getting off of work at 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock at night on swing shift and people trying to get out to the tavern in Falls City by 1 o'clock so they could buy a case of beer, you know. I mean, that wasn't an unusual instance. In fact, there was a Saturday night, and they had an old, about a 37 or 38 Chevy 2.5-ton truck that had a big pipe A-frame built on it for lifting things in the maintenance crew. And the story goes that Orly Eggeman and somebody else took that thing on a beer run to Falls City out over the mountain with this big A-frame sticking out there, you know, and stuck out there about 20 feet, you know, say 15 feet anyway, and then go on the Valsetz Road and imagine driving something like that over the hill to buy beer. They didn't have a job when they got back, but I guess they got their beer.
See, I'm thinking, right, see how it kind of gets flat up here on top? Yeah. That's where I think the football field's at, right up there flat.
All trace of the school where Jeff spent so much of his youth has gone.
Do you recognize anything?
No, not at all, really. I'm just pretty sure this is about where it was, where you turned and went down to the store. It was right in this area. Kind of based off this being Snob Hill area right behind us. You know, if we go back down further this way, maybe I might be able to bring something more or see something that will cross my mind more. But, you know, they came through and they tore down after tearing down all the homes, they also, chopped down all the trees, and, you know, the land barriers are kind of off a little bit. Yeah. This is where all the logs were that they left in the lake. And us kids would come out and jump the logs, jump from one log to another to go fishing or whatever. And sometimes just to play around on the logs too, you know. And looking at it now, they look like they're just so gray and old, kind of like bones out here. So I would have been here as a kid. This would be a lake, and obviously you'd have your lily pads growing up between your logs. The logs would be compressed together. And you just kind of make your paths out across these logs. Some of them smaller, some of them bigger. Feet might get a little wet, but the goal was to try to get all the way out to go to the fishing hole where you want to fish without getting wet. So you jump from one log to another hole in your fishing pole or whatever, and just cutting across these. And of course, if our parents found out, they'd beat our ass. But
we used to go jumping logs and fishing in between those logs where the bass would be underneath there. And I think my dad's best fishing pole is still at the bottom of that pond from when my brother dropped it when we were jumping logs.
I don't think I'd even want to try to jump logs these days.
Oh yeah, those idiots would go out there on the pond and see how far they could go on those logs. Yeah.
This kind of just reminds you of kind of an old gravesite in a way. I'm sure I jumped on many of these ones right here too. Wow. You know, it kind of just looks like a devastated area too, you know. Would you probably get an idea of maybe like a hurricane or tornado will tear everything up. But actually these logs were dumped into the river, or into the lake for the mill purposes, and they've just been abandoned here. Kind of fun right now. You know, it kind of brings me back to when I was jumping logs. Yeah, kind of nice to see this actually in a way, even though it's it's dated, so.
The logs that the kids jumped on were destined for the town's busy lumber mill, where they were fed into the great saws. Built in 1920, the mill ran profitably for original owners Cobbs and Mitchell. The Valsetz mill soon attracted a new owner, who converted the mill into a veneer plant.
The second owner of Valsetz was Herbert Templeton, who had actually been an executive with Cobbs and Mitchell, and then he sold Valsetz to Boise Cascade. And among the things they acquired was the Valsetz Lumber Company, which at that time included Valsetz and 2 communities in eastern Oregon.
After Boise Cascade bought the town in 1959, the lumber continued to flow through the mill. Jobs were secure, and the town, complete with a new plywood plant, settled in a period of relative calm. But now, businessmen rather than lumbermen were running the town. But no matter the owner, the mill was the lifeblood of everyone who lived in Valsetz.
When I first went to work in the mill, it seemed like a gigantic thing. I guess I'd never really worked hard in my life. The first job I can recall that I really struggled at was pulling veneer off of the dry chain coming out of the dryers. And I was really frustrated. I didn't do well that first day there. And over on the other dryer at break time, I remember one of the fellows grading over there that was a neighbor of mine, and I recall him saying, "Well, that new guy down on the end of the chain over there, he isn't much of a man, is he?" You know, I recall that distinctly. That was kind of like the first day. But I found my place. And
in 1978, Jim Travis was offered an opportunity elsewhere, and so he reluctantly left his home in Valsetz.
It was a very enjoyable part of my life. I learned more about people and relationships and getting along with people by necessity. That I used to joke that running the plywood mill is kind of a byline. It's, you know, something that I do, but the rest of it is what's important. And I value the time there very much.
On his departure, Jim believed he was leaving the town and the mill in good health.
No, it was still running full strength when I left. We ran 5 days a week, 3 shifts, some overtime on Saturday. So we ran around the clock, ran 3 shifts.
In early 1981, Boise Cascade placed this advertisement in Time magazine. It predicted that 1984 was going to be its best year ever. But later that year, the country was plunged into a severe economic recession, and the lumber trade suffered greatly as a result.
One of the things that was really interesting with people who lived in company towns is I don't think they ever believed that the town was going to close down. And in most cases that I researched, there were lots of warnings.
No, you couldn't say that, and the mechanics of the thing are the reason. You know, my whole life, and everybody that you would talk to that lived up there said how many times did I hear that the mill was going to close? It wasn't going to last for another year. Things like that. That was very common, year after year after year. You know, and there were heyday times when we were making all we could make, and you know, you could work all the overtime you wanted because they could sell everything at the profit, and everything was good. But it wasn't unusual to hear, well, you know, I don't know, there's not a lot of timber left, and if you don't get a few timber sales from the state or something, you know, I don't see how we can keep going, and things like that. Not unusual at all.
Then on December 13th, 1983, Boise Cascade announced that the mill was to close the following February.
You can probably read it on my face right now. It was really, I mean, you just wanted to cry. It was an incredible thing to realize that, you know, your life was going to change, and it wasn't just going to change in a small way. Everything about it was going to change. You weren't going to have a job. You weren't going to be living where you were living. You were going to have to find a home. You know, and you start thinking about all those things and start adding up the numbers of what it was going to cost you to move and so on and so forth. And then you kind of in the background, you realize that what you've known as your home is no longer going to exist. And it was a very, very difficult time, very heavy time on everybody.
I think my daughter came home because she was working graveyard and said they were closing. You know, I think of all these people, this is not good.
The town of Valsetz, a place that had meant so much to many over the decades, was to be completely destroyed and returned to the forest that had given birth to it decades before.
My most acute memory about Valsetz in general has to do with the day the mill closed. And you know, of all the memories I have, all those years and such wonderful, wonderful times, what my mind, when I first started thinking about Valsetz, the first thing that pops into my mind was the day the mill closed. And I recall walking into that building, and on my right there was a wall there, and there was a park bench there, you know, just a wooden bench. And there were 5, maybe 6 men sitting there. And the youngest was probably 50, 52, and the oldest was in his early 60s. And I recall distinctly that 3 of them were bawling. The tears were just flowing down their faces. They were totally heart-struck. And for me, that's the moment in time when I look back at it, that's the moment that I reflect on, that it drilled it home to me just how awful it was for people.
And the boys signed their log. And then it was party time. There was a lot of drunks running around.
The people of Valsetz were left with no option but to start to move away to a new life in the Willamette Valley and beyond.
One of the big shocks when people had to leave a company town was that they lost their job, they lost their home, they lost their neighbors, they lost their entire community. And that happened whether they chose to leave or whether the town disappeared for whatever reason. And certainly for people like those in Valsetz who hadn't had to think about where they were going to live or how they were going to pay the rent and where their kids were going to go to school and what they were going to do for their next job, it had to be a tremendous shock.
When I went up there in 1970, I rented my house for $40 a month, and since the company supplied the electricity, I paid $11 a month light bill. Many of the houses rented for less than $100, and that's another thing that unfortunately the people got dependent upon.
Some of the people up there lived literally from paycheck to paycheck, and if you had a bill at the store or at the rec hall, which you could get, maybe they didn't get much check.
To me, it seemed to me that the folks that it registered hardest with were typically those folks that were 50, 55 and older.
What made it so bad for the people in Valsetz was that so many of them were middle-aged and were only trained for an industry that was dying, was shrinking. That nobody really needed loggers anymore, and nobody needed mill workers. And even if they did, many of these people were not trained for the newest mills.
You know, you got 10 more years to work, and in those days they based your Social Security, I think, on your last 3 years of work, and now maybe you were going to be making a job that was minimum wage just because of your health condition and your age, because somebody didn't want to hire you to just work for another 6 years or so before you retire.
For some, leaving was a burden they just couldn't bear.
I recall one close friend that, you know, probably he was an alcoholic of some degree in Valsetz, but basically drank himself to death. I went to work in 1985, in July of 1985, I went to work for a company in Corvallis. And the first 2 years I was there, the first 5 years I was there, I probably was a pallbearer at probably, at least 12, maybe 14 funerals. And that's just the one, I'm just talking about the ones that I was a pallbearer at, not the ones that I went to. There were a lot of people that suffered very strongly through that process. It definitely had a toll.
This would have probably been our front yard, right here. Yeah. Boy.
Jeff's childhood home once stood on this spot.
You know, when I dream about being here as a kid, and you have dreams and you go back to your childhood, this is the house I dream about when I'm in. So is this house here. So it's kind of different. It looks a lot different. So we buried enough dogs in this yard. This here would be one of the trees that was up against the house right here. I'm thinking this is probably right where our kitchen was, you know, the kitchen area. You know, give or take a few feet probably. Now you got trees growing in it.
By the spring of 1984, Valsetz was almost empty.
They come by and they put orange X's on your houses, which meant that they're being tore down or burned down. They first started burning them down, and then people started getting upset about that quite a bit. And so they started bulldozing them down, then loaded them up in tractors or trucks and haul them into the mill. And then they would dump our homes inside the mill, because eventually they're going to burn the mill. So instead of waiting for people to move out and do this, they were doing it in front of you. So within days of you moving out of your house or whatever, they would come by and put the X on your house and tear it down. And other people, your neighbors are still there. So you're seeing the landscape change drastically.
You look around, you see, piles of ashes, or you see bare spots where all the other homes once were. You see the paved road going through town and, vacant areas on both sides. Where there were fences, the fences are gone. Where people's cars and homes were, they're just, remnants of, broken up boards, piles of ashes. In many cases, the ashes were still steaming. So if you look up the road, instead of chimneys with smoke coming out, you saw smoke coming out where homes once stood.
Now, the day that they burned mine down, they were tearing it down. Excuse me. I was in school. I was at the shop, and one of the kids, said, "Hey, they're knocking your house down." So we kind of lined up outside there and kind of watched it, and I guess I got a little upset. And our superintendent was Robert Hansen, Bob Hansen. He was a needle guy, and so he noticed that it was affecting at least me. So he decided to have a bonfire party, and went down and bought a bunch of hot dogs and soda pop and the whole works at the store. So we celebrated that. Yeah. That was a sad day.
In the spring of 1984, Boise Cascade torched the mill that had kept Valsetz alive for over 60 years. Ralph Thompson, for years in charge of mill maintenance, lit the fire.
Well, we had already knocked the building down, and then getting it ready to burn. And we didn't like to see the mill go in the first place, because it was being the maintenance supervisor, felt real bad about it, because we'd kept it running for so long, and it was pretty nice to be able to go in every morning and see everything running, and then we shut it down, and I don't know, kind of bothered you a little bit.
Oh, that was horrific. I still can't believe they did that. I can't say they even actually salvaged. They did salvage some, but that was a lot of old timbers and some of that could have been taken out, stack it up and burn it. Just a total, well, it was a write-off. Who in the heck cared?
Well, we just poured diesel oil in 3 or 4 places and touched it off and went back and watched it burn.
That was reality when that went up in smoke. And I remember the school deciding that they were not going to let us out to go watch. I mean, that's pretty much the end of it, right? When they burn the mill down, then it's real. They told us that, we would be getting in trouble if we went. We saw the smoke come, we just left. And then before long, the entire school showed up in the bus.
When we were at the mill, what I recall there is a couple of the bigwigs taking exception to us kids. We were probably not very nice for some of the remarks we made towards them. I think we knew that, what was going on. We didn't like the fact that the town was shutting down. This is our home, that type of thing, be able to intrude it on. So, yeah, I remember there was threats of, calling the police on us and things like that.
We were sitting there watching it burn, and you had to move back further and further and further. Helicopters flying over. I remember somebody had left the bulldozer too close to the actual building, and somebody had to run up there and get it and drive it out of there in that heat.
We had some of the people that worked at the mill that still lived in town showing up, and they wanted them to leave. These are the same guys that worked there for 20 plus years or whatever, that if there was a fire at the mill years prior, they would call them out of bed to come help fight it, or a forest fire. Here's these guys that gave their heart and soul to the place, and being treated like they no longer were deserving. So,
but for the most part, you have a lot of people standing around wondering, where their lives are going to go from there.
Well, it was the end of a year. End of your security blanket. Yeah.
For me, the overriding emotion was anger. I had spent so much of my own life trying to make it better for people up there by working through the union. And all I saw was everything being torn down and everybody impacted, and I was totally helpless to help them.
May 25th, 1984, graduation day at Valsetz High School.
The beginning of the end. It's, the end of Valsetz, but the beginning of our lives. And I think there were 9 of us in our class. And there was more cameras and media coverage up there that day than we had seen in our entire lives. And I remember walking up to the podium, and there were a dozen microphones all taped to the podium, and there was really no place to set your speech.
Boy, it was packed. The entire gymnasium, people outside. It was really packed. It seemed like anybody and everybody who came from Valsetz was there.
They did a wonderful job with that. The song from Cheers. All those kids got up and they started walking, kind of running around the gym. It was in the gym, and they were singing this song, where everybody knows your name.
I think the theme in there for me is you want to go where everybody knows your name is what sticks out with me. Is you want to be around the people that are like you, the ones that at that time are going through the same thing you are. So,
Valsetz was a place you could go. Everybody knows your name, everybody knows your business, and you're all still friends.
Senator Hatfield was there and spoke. Then, of course, the Air Force was there to award that scholarship to the Air Force Academy. It was a very well done ceremony. I was quite impressed with the way the kids handled it, how well they did it, and then the people that were there. It was very nice.
So it's odd being the last class to graduate from there, but by then you'd had plenty of time to wrap your brain around it, and we were 18, saw it different than the people that were 40-something, wondering where their life was going to go. When you're 18, you're looking for your lives to grow.
Yeah, it was nice. It was really nice. And I look at those kids now and I just, wow, they did well. They did well.
Hundreds of people attended what became known as the Last Hurrah. Among them was Jim Travis, back in Valsetz one last time.
Well, it was sad, knowing that they were the last class to graduate from that high school, and people were just coping with the fact that it's over. Finally, we have to go, because there were a lot of people who'd left in the interim that came back too. It was kind of a old friends get together. It's kind of like going to a funeral. We really don't like to be here, but it's good to see all of you, kind of a thing.
I mean, that whole weekend was considered the last hurrah, because you had the graduation night, which was on, I believe it was on a Friday night. It was the 25th of May of '84. And then the next day we had the final celebration, because people came up, a lot of people spent the night up there. The next day we had just a major event at the school grounds. And then the town just was a celebration outside of the school throughout what was left in the town. Some people's homes, they were having parties. So we just went from town, basically house to house and going up and down the streets. A final farewell, I guess, to, a youth, friends and family, a way of life.
Hours after the last hurrah, Valsetz, Oregon, home to thousands over the decades, was gone forever.
You can't live in the past. It's like when somebody dies, you have to make peace with it or you won't get over it. So it's ridiculous. Yeah. And when bad things happen, if you don't work through it, why, it's not good.
I feel like I was cheated out of part of my life, but if you look at all of the other small communities, the older I get, the wiser you become about, how these things happen.
One of the things after the town was tore down that I found remarkable when they had first cleared, they cleared everything first, they cleared the land. and then they planted it back to trees. But before the trees started growing, I was amazed at how small it was.
My two kids, for instance, will never go back because they don't want to remember it. They want to remember how it was when they left, not how it is today. I have gone back twice. I couldn't find anything. I couldn't even find a point of reference to say, oh, okay, now I know where I am. The railroad tracks are gone. You know, I'm sure that there are a lot of people who have never gone back and never will. And then there are some of us that, you know, want to see how it ended up.
With Valsetz being raised, the people who grew up there, the people who lived there for decades, can remember it as it was. It will be always fresh and pretty in their mind's eyes. And they will always remember the boardwalks. They will always remember the people who live next door. They will always remember the ball games, the bleachers. They will always remember the school plays. And they will never have to go back and see it run down.
The story of Valsetz has passed into legend. The children who grew up there now have children of their own, and the stories of the endless summers in Valsetz will, in time, be passed on to their children, whose laughter, in turn, will ring through the forest. Nature has reclaimed the land where Valsetz once stood. In time, the trees that grow there now will be cut by a new generation of loggers and milled by a new generation of mill workers. But not in Valsetz. Before he leaves Valsetz, Jeff makes a discovery that will make his trip back home worthwhile.
Oh, shit. Frank. Yeah. Well, one of my little toys. Because they had the spacewalk, you know, in '69, so they had a bunch of toys. It would have been like one of those little plastic toys for like the spaceman, you know, yeah. Yeah, they're white and blue and red. Yeah. Well, you just broke something now, didn't you? Yeah.
How does it feel finding that?
It's kind of different, isn't it? Isn't it? Yeah.
For Jeff, his toy is a reminder of a simpler time, a time when doors were left unlocked, when children could roam carefree, and when neighbors were friends. In some ways, that Valsetz is still alive, at least in the hearts of all who live there. And, like Jeff's toy, it's still there. It's just hidden in the trees.
For the people who know it, it is. For the people who don't, you know, they're not going to know much about it. It'll just be a story to them, but the ones that lived it is. So, yeah.
you.